Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 20 on seaweed carbon. This is a panel session that we were very eager to have, as this is a very hot topic at the moment in the seaweed space. And I think it's important for us to demystify what has been said and set some clear objectives on how we can really valorize carbon within seaweed. Before passing directly to the panel, we're going to have a very powerful keynote from Amber Nutall, Ambassador-in-Chief of the Blue Marine Foundation.
Hello and good evening, and good afternoon and good morning to you all, depending on where you're joining us from around this beautiful blue planet of ours. And my thanks to Seaweed Around the Clock, to Antoine, to Nicholas, and to Penn for including me. My name is Amber, and I think it's important to declare myself right at the start to be a layperson, a total non-expert, but dedicated and super passionate advocate for our oceans and all who inhabit them. I had the great privilege of growing up on the sandy shores of the Bahamas, a place I still very much regard as home, where today I sit on the board of the Bahamas Reef Environment Educational Foundation. And due to the vast majority of my adult life being lived here in the UK, another fantastic island nation, I found myself another excellent organization to work alongside, spearheaded by the great Charles Clover, the Blue Marine Foundation. Incidentally, and forgive me for this, Charles has finally written another book. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his first, The End of the Line. His new book is out next week, and I'm lucky enough to have had a copy already that I've dove straight into, and I couldn't resist recommending it. So forgive me for shouting out to Rewilding the Sea, but I really recommend highly for anybody who loves the oceans to give it a read. And now to our topic of the hour, or should I say 24 hours, seaweed. I have often found over the years that seaweed garners the same enthusiasm amongst my friends as when I try and discuss soil. I see first a slightly squeamish look and then slow dawning horror that I might actually be trying to take up some of their precious time discussing such a mundane subject. You, however, are tuned in this evening as you are one of the enlightened ones who get it, and you're here to learn more and share more. We live in an age where curiosity, courage, innovation, and imagination have never been of such critical importance, yet seemingly in such short supply. We have big goals ahead of us, reducing global carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. And entirely by 2050. We need to protect and restore vast areas across the world, forests, wetlands, grasslands, and of course, our oceans. The challenges ahead are daunting, but please always keep in mind what success looks like and hold that image in your heart as it's a stunner. Seas teeming with fish once again, thriving ecosystems, regeneration around every corner, supporting the very pillars of life and the harmony I believe this will bring to humanity through this recovery. And today we're here to discuss how seaweed can help, or indeed, if it can, with this particular carbon challenge. The pressure is on. Is this humble aquatic plant the answer to all our prayers? We know it's nutrient-packed superfood. It's great for humans and for animal consumption, with the added bonus of reducing the release of methane in ruminants, cows, sheep, and goats. Seaweed is a provider of habitat for marine life, absorber of excess nutrient runoff from the land. As a bioplastics material, provides fibers for fashion. It's fast growing with no requirements of fresh water, nor fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. No land clearing required. Phew. Farming seaweed has long provided an alternative income stream for poor coastal communities, fishing families, and in particular women folk from these fishing families. And of course, seaweed requires that great building block, carbon, and plenty of it during its rapid growth. But how best should we be using this king among plants? And is it a viable part of our journey to net zero? Can this carbon be locked away? Is it indeed financially viable? Is it scalable? Is it fast enough solution? But bigger than that, does it actually work? And what are the possible negative side effects? Are there any unforeseen repercussions? What realistically could the world grow to sequester? Would it be enough to shift the dial? Sounds simple enough. Rapidly grown and harvested seaweed, taken by a barge to a predetermined drop-off point, where it can then fall to the depths of the abyssal plain. Or will it? And then what? How indeed is this massive amount of falling seaweed greeted on the seafloor? What repercussions are there? Could it be unsettling for the ecosystem, which is used to the remains of an occasional whale settling in the murky sediments? The very, very occasional whale. Or is this a scandalous use of our otherwise valuable, nutritious product on a crowded planet inhabited by all too many humans suffering from poor diets? Is it a daft consideration, or worse still, a wasteful one? Professor Carlos Durant predicts the contribution of blue carbon to mitigating climate emissions could be as high as 10 to 15% if all blue carbon strategies are activated, including as yet unexplored possibilities such as more seaweed farming, avoiding disturbing sediments on continental shelves, restoring kelp forests, and protecting whales. Other scientists caution that uncertainty in some areas, such as seaweed farms and kelp, neither of which are included in the IPCC's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, makes accurate predictions difficult. That's why Durant wants to study these areas. He's working with Oceans 2050, an organization run by Alexandra Cousteau, the granddaughter of the oceanographer Jacques Cousteau. And they're sampling sediments from seaweed farms in 12 countries to find out how much carbon they really soak up. These studies need to be done, they must be done, but they take time, and time is not on our side. The urgency and importance of the conversation this evening is not to be underestimated. From a report published by Blue Marine, called Blue Carbon, A New Frontier for Conservation, I quote, "Seaweed is often not fully considered in blue carbon discussions, despite its great potential." The report goes on to refer to Professor Durant's project. Around half of the seaweed that grows on these farms becomes detached and then drifts away before harvesting. And some of this later acts as carbon sink on the seafloor. They found that this industry had significant potential to contribute to global climate mitigation through sequestration, with one estimate of industry growth predicting removal of 0.3 gigatons of carbon per year by 2050. Just to put that into context, we need a reduction of 15 gigatons each year to get us to our 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. So now I'm going to step aside. Like so many of you, I have plenty of questions, but I do believe that seaweed has an important, indeed vital role to play and plenty to contribute, which means front row seats for us all, as there are exciting, pioneering times ahead, full of challenges for sure, but opportunities galore too. So without further ado, I will hand over to the fantastic panelists lined up for you by the Seaweed Around the Clock team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber, for setting the tone. I think a lot has been said, and it's going to be perfect to continue this conversation with the panel. So let us introduce, first of all, the three panelists that we have. First of all, Kyla Orr, so CEO of Kelp Crofting, a seaweed farm in Scotland. Secondly, we have Jean-Baptiste Thomas from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And finally, replacing Mar Fernandez, who unfortunately could not be here, is Viktor, who is working with her at Seafields Solutions. So as we move forward, I think we're going to directly dive into the situational awareness around seaweed carbon. I think before diving into the technicalities, understand what has already been done around seaweed carbon in this space, whether it's in research or in the industry. Kyla, I'll let you start.
Just a brief background to myself. I'm based up in Scotland, as Antoine mentioned, and I did my PhD at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, looking at the ecological impacts of using seaweed principally beach cast seaweed for biofuel. And as part of that process, had to look at the entire food web that is built off kelp detritus. So what we're considering to be a blue carbon source in this discussion. And it basically looked where that carbon was flowing in the food web and revealed that it is an incredibly important part of coastal food webs. And when I mean coastal, that's nearshore waters. And 10 years after that, have ended up setting up a seaweed farm in Scotland and being right, in the center of the blue carbon debate and what we do with our seaweed that we grow. And our focus really in a small coastal community farmers to maximize value so that we can basically make ends meet financially. And that can't be done with blue carbon at the moment. And also seeing the race for the seabed and coastal areas, people wanting to set up seaweed farms for blue carbon because it seems like an incredibly good idea, but as yet science there isn't enough science to prove it. And so seeing increasingly concerned members of the coastal community saying, oh, is this a valid reason to give up space? So that's the position that I'm coming from in this debate, from an academic background, but also from a kelp farming, sort of at the coalface background.
Super, thank you very much, Kyla. Viktor, we'll pass with you now.
Okay, I need to explain my background. I have been working on the carbon cycle now for very many years, 50 and plus, and I'm a professor for biooceanography. Started my career in Kiel Bight, working on shallow systems and also included some seaweed. And since then I moved to the Southern Ocean, the open ocean, and I've been working on plankton. And I've been working on glacial interglacial cycles in the past, where massive amounts of carbon dioxide were sequestered. Then we had a glacial period, and then they were released, and then we had an interglacial. Now we are in an interglacial, and we've gone beyond that. We are now into a super interglacial, and we are warming. And I am very much concerned about the future of our planet. And I'm at the end of my career. I retired 10 years ago, as a matter of fact, but I'm still active. And my experience has been with iron fertilization in the Southern Ocean, because it's the iron fertilization that has led to glacial interglacial cycles. The problem with plankton, though, is that the carbon to nitrogen ratio, carbon to nutrient ratio, is too low to manage huge amounts, the huge amounts that Amma mentioned, and then you, Kyla, as well, that have to be removed from the atmosphere to stop the big melt. The big melt is coming in, it's inevitable. And we just can't let that happen, even if it's going to happen in 1,000 years, right? It's just up to us now, because once that tipping point is reached, once the ice caps on Antarctica and Greenland have reached, shrunk a little bit, then there's no stopping them. So there's still hope now. And for me, seaweed offers the most potential, because if you grow it in the open ocean, then we have space, unlimited space, basically. And for those of you who are not aware of how much carbon you have to remove the amount of the gigatons of carbon that have to be removed are equivalent to what is in the whole biosphere at the moment, right? The plants in the biosphere have 450 gigatons of carbon. And 450 gigatons of carbon is, in terms of packed fresh weight, 4,500 cubic kilometers. Cubic kilometers. I mean, just let that sink in. Kilometer up, kilometer here, kilometer there, and 4,500 kilometers down that. That's the amount of carbon to make the difference that we have to remove and sequester. And where can we do that? We can only do that in the open ocean, in my opinion, because there we have the space. And the place to sequester it is on the deep sea floor, because there also we have the space. The deep sea, I know that a lot of people are concerned about the deep sea, but as I told you, I'm a biooceanographer. I have experience with the ocean and with the biosphere. And I have a lot of other concerns. My other concern on the side, by the way, is the whales. You have to bring the blue whales back, and that's possible. It's possible because we know how managed to reach where the size that they attain and the biomass and so on. And we can also do that with the seaweed. So I want to spread this message of hope that we can do these things. And these open ocean seaweed farms, they would be, compared to the size of the open ocean, there would be tiny oases in this vast deserts that nobody speaks about because they are deserts. They're neutral from all points of view. They're productively neutral. From the carbon dioxide uptake and release, they're neutral. I mean, nothing is going on there. That's why we don't talk about them. These are the subtropical gyres of the open ocean. And since the sargassum influx that we've seen now in the Atlantic, in the Great Sargassum Belt, right? This is sargassum that escaped from the Sargasso Sea and proliferated and showed the potential of the sargassum. Since then, I have hope. And the subtropical gyres are vast deserts because they have no nutrients. But those nutrients can be provided because these are warm water lenses of about 200-300 meter thickness that are sitting on an unlimited nutrient source in the deep ocean. It's like having an aquifer below the Sahara, an unlimited aquifer, because if you tap it, you get new water coming in to replace that. So these things are totally sustainable. They would be autonomous because we would be using solar energy and we have the space for that. And they would then provide hope for humanity today, which is, we are at the brink of catastrophe. And you have to realize what is coming our way when the climate refugees start spreading. And we've had it. See, I come originally from India. And I'm very concerned about terrestrial ecosystems, tigers and elephants, right? We have national parks to maintain them. But will we be able to, will it be ethical to maintain national parks for wild animals when humanity is spreading out and is going for the higher ground, right? So forget the polar bears. It's the tigers and the elephants and the lions and everything else on the planet. There's few percent of wild animals left, biomass left, that have to be saved. And the solution there is the open ocean. Because there we do the least damage and have the least impact also in terms of biodiversity. Because what we would be growing in these open ocean farms would be food primarily. Obviously, we would first, whatever we harvest over there, would first go for the primary uses, and what's left over, but that we could expand, would then be for sequestration. All right, you can ask me questions later on about about the technical details, but this is sort of my vision of.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victor. We're going to dive into the technicalities after. I'm going to let first Jean-Baptiste Thomas give his vision with his publication that is soon to be published. Jean-Baptiste, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll get to that in a second. I just want a quick disclaimer. I have bronchitis, so I may be coughing from time to time. I'm a researcher at KTH. I did finished my PhD 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been working with trying to provide some sort of systems perspective, life cycle assessments on seaweed farming amongst other types of low trophic aquaculture. So trying to account for greenhouse gases alongside other things like eutrophication mitigation potential of seaweed farms has been a core part of my research over these past years. I've also worked with Beachcast, so I was familiar with Kyla's work a long time ago when I was working with that. And I'm really fascinated to hear about what Victor's talking about in the open ocean. It sounds really promising, and thank you for that little seed of hope there. My perspective, basically the systems perspective on, let's say, these pilot scale seaweed farms that we see in Europe emerging at the moment isn't as hopeful as that. It looks like these supply chains are typically quite carbon intensive. Whether it's the boats that we use, the ropes that are growing the substrate, that are growing the seaweed at sea, or the anchors, the screw anchors installation, the drying of the seaweed or using it fresh, whatever it is, there are carbon emissions for each of these steps across the supply chain, and a lot of unknowns as we go across the supply chain. So one of this publication that Antoine just referred to, I have a screenshot of a sort of a graphical abstract here, which I will share. This paper is now being sort of it's minor revisions to be submitted again soon. So we hope to have it published in the next month or so. But this sort of shows you the paper is split out into these 4 sections here, and we review each part of these in terms of climate effects. And I guess this is kind of, at least we tried to write the paper so that it was a bigger picture. It could be applicable to whether we're talking about wild or cultivated seaweed or different ways of cultivating. A lot of the issues are the same at sea. The supply chain emissions, wherever the biomass comes from, there are always supply chain emissions when it's being processed. And then you have these different ways of handling climate impacts in the use phase, which methodologically, I guess you could say, have evolved from the bioenergy sector and forestry sectors, in which research has been conducted on how to handle forestry and biofuel carbon for decades. So whether you're talking about product substitution, eating a seaweed burger instead of a beef burger, well, there's all sorts of discussions around this. So we try to cover this in the paper, and I'm happy to answer questions about that if you're interested. And then, of course, where does this carbon that's originally assimilated end up? Well, most of it ends up at the moment back in the atmosphere when it's consumed. Very little today ends up in long-term carbon stocks. So there is a bigger picture to consider here. And life cycle assessment studies are typically cutting off at gate, so at farm gate, or if they do go all the way through to the end of the life cycle, they're closer to carbon neutral, or maybe just slightly more carbon being sequestered than is emitted across the life cycle of the whole supply chain. So we're calling into, we're pointing towards the knowledge gap, the main emission points, and trying to highlight where more research needs to be done here for us to really be able to do this at scale, if this is truly a solution or not. We need to figure this out urgently, and we need to be doing this from the ground up, using a systems perspective to make sure we're not missing any hidden elephants in the room, so to speak.
Well said, Jean-Baptiste. And so I think with what you just shown, I think it's important to start from the beginning. So with seaweed farming. So Kyla, this question is for you. So how do you, as a seaweed farmer, evaluate this all this carbon story that's being developing? How do you see the potential growing? Do you actually think it's a viable strategy for you to pursue at the moment? Please elaborate on this.
Yeah, well, just picking up from Jean-Baptiste, it's all to do with the supply chain and what you do with your seaweed and how you process it. And there are some very energy intensive steps in seaweed processing, for example, in the drying of seaweed. And a lot of work needs to be done to reduce the energy consumption required to process seaweed. So we've taken quite a reserved approach to the seaweed for blue carbon. I don't openly praise it, but I also wouldn't completely slam it, because I think there are ways to work, to improve our efficiencies, our carbon efficiencies, basically. As a seaweed farmer in a coastal area, I would again say that coastal's not really the place that you want to be trying to install seaweed farms for blue carbon. The focus should rather be in offshore waters, because our coastal waters in Scotland are very crowded. There's a lot of fishing activity, there's renewable installations going in, there's shipping channels, and using space for blue carbon within a coastal community is effectively taking away jobs, when that space could actually be provided in an offshore environment. So I would definitely say that's where the focus needs to be. And I think people need to remain critical about every step of their supply chain, and farmers in particular. What are they going to do with their seaweed, and what are their emissions going to be in that supply chain, and try and just not greenwash people to try and get the funds in and sell your seaweed, because ultimately it will reflect badly on the industry. And we have to get the science right, and we have to look at the whole picture and draw that carbon life cycle analysis box around the entire supply chain.
Of course, you're absolutely right. And especially today, you know, there's a lot of people hoisting seaweed as the savior of climate change, and that's going to reverse everything all by itself. And I think it's important to point out that it does have potential, but there's still a lot of work to be done in understanding how these mechanics are going to be work, how it can be quantified. So actually afterwards we can go towards corporates, we can go towards institutions and saying, okay, this is how we can provide a tangible solution in the future. And so to talk about offshore then, Viktor, you were already mentioning this in your introduction. How would you see the role of offshore large-scale farms, therefore, in this fight for the carbon, for the seaweed carbon?
Well, the reason why we have to go out is to take pressure off the congested coastal regions from the land side as well as on the ocean side. As Kyla mentioned, it's perfectly true that we can't do that along the coastal margins. But the open ocean, as I told you, and particularly the subtropical gyres, these are these vast areas that are not on anybody's radar. They're just not thought about, and they constitute half the planet's surface. 50% of the planet's surface is subtropical gyre, desert. And as I mentioned, we can tap deep nutrient-rich water and bring it up by using a technique of a counterflow technique. These are pipes with the double pipes, where an inner pipe brings cold water up, cold, low salinity water. I have to mention that the subtropical gyres, because of evaporation, have a very high salinity, and that's why they're also warm. And because they're warm and they can keep this high salinity water at the surface. The water below has a lower salinity because it comes from the polar regions and has high nutrients and has a low salinity. So if we warm that low salinity water to the temperature at the surface, then it will flow up by itself. And this warming can be done by a counterflow of surface water, meaning the subtropical mixed layer water, which is then cooled while it's warming the water which is rising. And this counterflow can bring, we can come to figures in the order of cubic meter per second in these pipes, like with the 2 or 3 meter diameter pipes. Now, of course, you would need huge numbers of pipes, millions of pipes to make a difference. I mean, if you're talking about gigatons per year. But these pipes could then be made. I mean, this is my vision, right? And this is a vision that if we really put our minds to it, and we various fields of science are now are poised to take this thing forward, that we could make these pipes out of seaweed raw material. We would have to start, of course, with conventional materials for the prototypes, but then these prototypes could then be replaced with seaweed based plastic alternatives, which would already be part of the sequestration drive, right? So since we are at a situation now, the planet is at a situation, the Anthropocene, where we need epochal solutions. So for me, seaweed farming in the open ocean is equivalent to the dawn of the era of agriculture on land, which happened like more than 5,000 years ago. And that's where we are now. And we have the ability, we have the science, we have the engineering, we already have open ocean islands that are harbor islands, right? That can be maintained in the open ocean. And there are all these other knowledge bases in various fields that need to be brought together and put in and focused on this particular aim of growing as much biomass as possible, using that biomass sensibly for all the purposes that it could be used for, including human food, animal food, whatever, everything, right? And of course, we would then be also, of course, growing stuff like fish and the human food as well. And that would take pressure off the wild stocks, because we would be establishing artificial ecosystems, just like the irrigated fields of the subtropical zones in the arid zones, like in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, right? All these huge civilizations, sustainable civilizations, they lasted for thousands of years, were possible because of irrigation. So these pipes that I'm talking about are now the modern irrigation systems that once in place would run by themselves. They would not need any energy. So we would not be diverting any materials or energy from what's already in use on land or on the coastal area. Right? These things would be autonomous. They would be sustainable. We would use solar energy. The subtropical gyres are also the calmest places on the planet. The eastern halves, not the western. That's where the hurricanes start. But in the eastern halves, where you have cold water coming, cooler water flowing south, there you don't have those storms. These are places where we could establish these farms. And it's a question of just focusing and going for it and doing it.
Absolutely. And so to kind of link with Jean-Baptiste's study. So Jean-Baptiste, because in your system, of course, you said that right now the carbon potential of the evaluation of carbon potential within the seaweed farms is a bit complex to measure. How do you think this could be done when it increases in scale? Do you think it can happen? Do you think it's still debatable? How do you see it work?
These types of studies can always be conducted as long as we have good quality data input. So when it comes to LCA at sea and marine production systems, we do have a lot of challenges with the databases not being really, let's say, accurate or up to date when it comes to specifically agriculture, for instance. Things like ropes are missing, so we don't have good data there. But if we have good scaled production systems or scalable production systems, we can do LCAs and get a good idea on these carbon balances. I think what I'm hearing from Viktor here is very compelling. I would love to know more about all of these things and help to develop LCAs on them. I think Mara and I have been talking about this for a very long time. So I hope that we can move forward with that someday. But it really does sound very compelling. I have a lot of questions about the nutrient side of things at sea, and I always envisioned sort of large-scale, long-line seaweed farming. If that had to be the part of the solution, then it would have to take place at the mouth of big estuaries, say, for instance, the Mississippi, or perhaps off of the coast of Brazil, where the Amazon, and I've seen satellite pictures of these sort of huge microalgae gyres coming out from these estuaries, and instead we could have seaweed farms sucking up a lot of that nutrient, and possibly storing carbon in a product or another, and then being able to also bring those nutrients back to land, to make sure that we don't lose any of that phosphorus, which is finite and running out. So there's so much potential, I think, from seaweed being used in the right way, but at the moment I'm not seeing it happening quite yet. I think we need to have investments and resources sent in the right way, and some of the reports that we've seen come out lately seem to be overhyping this, presenting it in front of world leaders in a way which is, this is your solution, here, take your silver bullet and enjoy it. When it's not, when the science isn't settled yet, we have a lot of questions that need to be answered, and really quickly. And from where I'm sitting as a seaweed researcher, I'm not seeing that many opportunities for funding coming up to answer some of these questions. So those are some other issues to throw into the arena here for the discussion. I don't know if I answered your question, Antoine, but there we go.
Yeah, you perfectly did, and we'll dive into those challenges just afterwards. But to continue on this side of, so the farms already have a potential, but as you all mentioned, it depends what we do with the seaweed. So of course, the first thing we think about is the applications. Of course, food today is one of the most popular, but as we all mentioned today, it's how that life cycle assessment is being done afterwards and saying, okay, is the carbon going to go back in the atmosphere or not? So I'm going to start once again with Kyla, because you're also looking into that processing structure as well down the line. What would you think for you would be the most valid applications and solutions to move forward in order to validate this carbon potential for the seaweed?
I think the first step would be low energy processing. So moving away from high energy drying, or moving away from drying seaweed altogether to stabilizing it with other methods. For example, you can ferment or ensile seaweed to lower the pH, so that stabilizes it for a fairly long period of time. Because pretty much the minute you harvest your seaweed, it's full of natural bacteria, some good, some not so good. And that bacterial colony will just expand and explode unless you deal with that seaweed very, very quickly. And that's why we have these energy intensive processing steps, is to stabilize it, stick it in a freezer, put it through a dryer quickly as possible before it rots. So the first solutions need to be found on the processing side of things on land. And then the second solutions need to be found in products that lock that carbon away for as long as possible. I mean, there's carbon capture is one thing. You can have a carbon neutral product with, CO2 into the seaweed, into the food, and then out through the human respiration. That's a relatively short carbon cycle. But if we really want to make an impact, we need to lock that away in products as long as possible, or use the seaweed products to promote growth of other carbon capture resources. So, for example, as soil improvers, and use it to promote growth of trees and reforestation, and again to bring nutrients onto very impoverished soils. So I really see that's where we need to focus, is finding the right products to get the right solutions, and not just throwing the name of blue carbon into every single product, because they don't all sequester carbon at all. I mean, some of them will produce, some processes will produce, release more carbon than the seaweed actually absorbed, depending on the processing step. So there needs to be real investment in processing and product innovation if we want to get this right.
Absolutely, and even in some cases, there's even the supply chain itself, because sometimes we have the seaweed in one place in the world, we send it to another place, and then it's sold in a completely different market. So when we just look at that side of the story, the entire carbon benefit of seaweed is completely nullified. So it's important also to have that circular and centralized area where really it's locally produced, so we can really optimize that carbon benefit of the seaweed products that we're actually selling. So Viktor, yes,
can I just jump in? I
Jean-Baptiste.
just want to say one of the things about seaweed farmers that I've been coming across over the years is that, of course, they seem to be primarily driven by a will to do good for the planet and to try to do the right thing with their career path and their life choices. But they are also trying to hold up a business, and at the end of the day, value is the driver for the business. So the products that you choose and the processing methods that you choose are what you can afford. And right now, the drying systems that are run from fossil fuels are the only ones that you can actually get a product dried to market, stable, safe for consumption. So options are still limited. And though I totally agree with you, Kyla, we need more research on low energy solutions. It's not easy. I know there's a lot of work being done right now on fermentation, and it sounds really, really promising. But there are challenges out there, and if there are solar-based solutions that will work in Scotland, then I hope to hear about them in the chat right here today. Thank you. And yeah, just the key point value of products.
You're absolutely right about the research itself. Of course, it's important to set those objectives up in the future, but of course, there's still some work that needs to be done. We've seen it this year with all the carbon talk that there's been having. That there's still some progress to be made. Viktor, on your side, so of course you were talking about these large-scale farms. So of course, with all this production, there is a need to do something with it. So of course, there's for these large-scale farms, there's the option of using that seaweed for various applications, but some are also mentioning about sinking it. What's your opinion on these different options, and which one do you think is the most viable in the future?
Well, of course, the first step that has to be taken is to provide the nutrients to grow large enough amounts of seaweed at the surface, and there, since we're in the open ocean, when we are sitting on the deep sea, the deep sea floor, where we all know, which is very cold and has a very low breakdown rate. So for instance, we could store stuff on the deep sea and bring it up again when required, because it would be, if you take a fish, I mean, it wouldn't be an open fish, right? It would be packaged, but if it's put on the deep sea floor, it's like putting it in a refrigerator, for instance. And same applies to seaweed and so on. And we don't need much energy to bring it up and bring it down and to transport it sideways. And so what I'm thinking about is going to be a totally different level of activity, human activity, right? It's going to be at the scale of the oil and gas companies that have led to all this pollution. So this is going to be a huge effort, and it's the only way to save the planet. I mean, seriously, now everybody's talking about saving the planet, but if we have that in mind, if you want to stop the big melt, this has to be huge scale, and that is available, but it's not at the scale that we are active at now, right? I mean, it's like comparing the grain fields of the Ukraine with vegetable plots here within a city, right? So this has to be a different scale, totally different scale. And then of course things will also be happening differently. So what I would be thinking is that we would have processing ships on site, right? All these things would be on site. They would be happening out there in the open ocean, in the subtropical gyres, where we would be establishing farms, factories, right? The seaweed will be processed on site, because these are huge amounts, as I told you. A gigaton of carbon is 10 cubic kilometers of seaweed biomass. 10 cubic kilometers. 1 gigaton of carbon. So to process that amount, we need to have the gear to do it, but the energy is not going to be that. The demand is not going to be that much. We would be harvesting the seaweed at the surface. We wouldn't even lift it off the surface. We would keep it underwater, process it there, bale it there, find techniques to convert the seaweed and to use the organics in the seaweed. Seaweeds are composed of two major components: the plasma, which phytoplankton also has and all living organisms have, and the cell walls. And the cell walls of brown algae are particularly refractory. See, in the old days, they used to build dikes out of them. In the Netherlands, the first dikes built in the Netherlands were made out of seaweed. And then they ran out of seaweed because they took the rocks on which the seaweed was growing and converted those into roads in the cities. So there were no more seaweeds. So that was the end of that. And then they tried to make dikes out of wood, and then they rotted. Didn't work. And then, of course, now we have the modern dikes. But I'm just giving you a feeling for this, right? How we've changed the surface of the planet. The place where I live is a mud flat. It wasn't a mud flat before. There were lots of rocks lying around, and all those rocks were harvested, by those divers, the guys with those helmets, and the tube. What were they doing? They were collecting rocks. So the streets of Amsterdam are plastered with those rocks. Right? And people don't realize how much we have changed the ocean. Right? We have wrecked the ocean. The ocean is not any pristine to be left to itself type of ecosystem. It's on its knees. We have to get in there, intervene. We have to bring back the ocean to what it used to be, and that is something very different to what we are seeing now. So if we're talking about negative effects, sure, we're going to change huge areas of the open ocean, but then to the betterment of the ocean margins, we can bring that life back that was there, let's say 400 or 500 years ago. Right? I mean, when you think about those huge fish swarms and so on that were in the coastal ocean, they were depleted, they were taken out, but also their environment was changed. So we're living in a completely different kind of ecosystem now that can be brought back.
You're absolutely right, and this was actually brought up in several conversations in previous sessions, notably on the energy, on exactly how we could optimize open sea. and really make it a huge potential for the seaweed industry down the line, and reduce, all the costs, reduce the carbon emissions as well, and all those different things. So for those who are interested, definitely check out those sessions as well. And so to follow on this, so there is a huge potential. There's still a lot of work to do. So for each panelist here, what would be the next steps for you? What would be the next action plans that farmers, research institutions, industry should take in order to make this happen? We'll start with Jean-Baptiste.
Where to begin? Goodness. I think there's a lot of things that have been said already. As Viktor says, I think the gigascale, what's being proposed by Seafields and a couple of other groups that are proposing open ocean farming like that sounds really fantastic. I really need more research in that to try to test this stuff and see what can be done. The ad seed processing, there's so much potential there. There's so many decommissioned oil rigs that could be put to use for this kind of thing. Yeah, I think there needs to be prioritization in that direction, without forgetting, of course, the potential of longline farming in coastal areas, the benefits to local communities that have been battered by the sort of slow disintegration of fishing communities. So again, there's so many different directions. We can't be fixated only on the climate issue of the next decade. There are plenty of other things that seaweed can be contributing to without necessarily having a major impact or positive sort of mitigating effect on the climate. For my part, recognition of the importance of life cycle assessments in carbon accounting would be a welcome thing. I think some of these reports that came out in the last couple of years hardly mentioned LCA at all, or any form of carbon accounting for that matter, which is frightening given the hype that surrounded them. There are certain protocols and methods in place for carbon accounting and carbon crediting, and those should really be improved upon and followed. Carbon crediting has its weak points too. It's a good starting point, but it was a lot of compromise in order to get to where we stand today, and it's not as robust as it could be. But there's a lot of work to be done. It's hard to pinpoint any particular area, but certainly opening up resources to fund more research on how we can use these oceans of ours to improve well-being of people and planet and biodiversity, and solve the climate crisis, all of the above.
It's exactly that, and we had a conversation just before. The social aspect, the human aspect is just as important. A lot of people focus solely on the climate because it has a huge, of course, it is a huge challenge we're facing today. A lot of people are talking about it, but nonetheless, none of this would be possible without the coastal communities who are, at the forefront of all these challenges that we're facing today. So integrating them within this carbon model is vital in order to guarantee something in the future. And so talking about this, so Kyla, what would be your next steps?
Well, like I say, next steps within our little companies is really to reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible and live true to the reasons why we set up the company in the first place, to revitalize our oceans and continue to make every effort to reduce that, our carbon emissions through that process. I would like to see there be more clarity and definition in the market value of different seaweed products, because as the seaweed economy is building in coastal communities, as Jean-Baptiste mentioned, we're all having to focus on running our businesses and paying the bills at the end of the day, and that means focusing on the highest value products, which are basically food, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, that end of the supply, of the product range. And if these big offshore farms were to start producing seaweed for food, it would be quite scary for a coastal seaweed farm, to be honest, because we would never be able to supply seaweed as cheap as you could produce it at a mega ocean farm. Whereas, these offshore farms could produce seaweed for bioplastics, for example, and textiles, the real bulk markets. agricultural food. Agriculture, animal food, and so some differentiation between these markets, I think, is really important to allow both industries to thrive, because one could really, the big offshore farms could lead to the collapse of the inshore industry, which we're working really hard to build at the moment, which would be a real shame if they undervalued our products. So I'd like to see more work done on that front.
It's all about the optimization of space, identifying where the needs are, and understanding what the priorities are according to the needs. So all these are different things, of course, research, understanding, getting the data. These are not new things that we're telling people. So it's all about that research and understanding everything before making those propositions. Viktor, for the closing, what would you have to say?
So, but I agree with Kyla. I mean, what we are comparing on the one hand are vegetable gardens, which we are going to need anyway, with extensive wheat fields, which we now need, right? That are harvested with combined harvesters and so on, right? But then, of course, these offshore really large farms, they would also provide jobs to the global south, because the continents abutting them are exactly the global south, Africa and South America, for instance. And they would be, this is opening a whole new dimension, a whole new epoch in human history that has to be jump-started now and pushed. And the first step, of course, is, and that's what we are engaged in, Seafields is doing this now, we are trying to make these these pipes, these double stommel pipes, as they're called, prototypes, and to see to optimize them to get maximum flow rates. And the flow rate, of course, is going to depend on various factors, and that's being modeled at the moment. And then from there, we need to of course, attract huge amount of finances, because this is going to require it. But this is going to be the first step. But after that, verifying the amount of carbon that's being fixed will be simple, because these will be these blocks of compressed seaweed that will be sitting on the deep sea floor. They would just be occupying space, and they could be processed in such a way, if they're compacted sufficiently, but this is all research that has to be done, right? And compacted and packed together, then there would be, the oxygen demand would also be very, very low. So we won't be affecting the deep sea. But we also have to remember that the deep sea in the next so many thousand years is going to become anoxic once Antarctica starts to melt, because then the deep water formation will no longer be ventilated to the surface. So I mean, for people who say, we have to save the deep sea, we're going to lose the deep sea as well. We're going to lose everything. This is what drives me crazy, and this is what makes me focus on these huge situations, because the problem is that size. So the individual things is going to be establishing these modular farms. These farms will be modular, right? They could be then just multiplied once we've got the technology to do it. I mean, like 20 years ago, we wouldn't have thought of 3D printing. I mean, just think of all the advances that have been happening in the last 10, 15 years and project that into the future. And all the manufacturing industries are saying also that we are now entering totally new areas of engineering, open ocean engineering, but also materials production. You're going to have completely different kinds of materials available then. And then, of course, the slow process of breeding now can be accelerated incredibly with the new techniques that we have. Right? So we could then start optimizing the products that we need, and the seaweed we would be growing then, 10 years from now, would be as different from our vegetables, the cauliflower that we are eating now, compared to the original wild plant, right? Which looks nothing like a cauliflower or a cabbage or whatever, right? So we're going to have completely new kinds of crops that we'll be growing there, with totally different, with requirements that we could tune, that we could then use for this purpose. So we are not going to wreck the planet. We're going to save the planet with enlightened interventionism. This is what I call myself, an enlightened interventionist.
I like the parallels that you're doing between land and sea. I think they're very relevant, and it kind of shows the situation in the sea can be very similar to what we have in land, but we just need to do it a bit smarter in some cases.
Exactly.
As time is almost there, what I'd like is one sentence per person, one short sentence if possible, not a run-on one, about seaweed carbon. So if you had one message to give to the audience about seaweed carbon, what would it be? So Kyla, I'll let you start first. Short sentence.
Oh, you put me on the spot.
No, of course. Yeah, I know.
Seaweed carbon. Seaweed carbon has great potential if done right. So.
Perfect. Super. Jean-Baptiste?
I was going to say something along those lines. I'd actually like to steal Viktor's enlightened interventionism there. That's brilliant. As a species, we're constantly intervening in our planet's everything, and using our brains to do it cleverly would be nice for a change. But yeah, more informed and less hype talk about blue carbon and seaweed would be nice.
Perfect. And so, Viktor, we stole your idea. So
wild sargassum has already been shown to have doubling rates of 11 days, meaning that you start with a ton in the beginning of the year and you have 10 billion tons at the end of that year, theoretically. And the cooling of the planet that happened after the age of the dinosaurs was enabled by the Azolla event. Just look it up on the web. The Azolla event was a fern. It was a fern floating on the Arctic Ocean that in the space of just 90,000 years took out 1,000 ppm of CO2 from the atmosphere and started the cooling. So the ocean is the place where we can do large-scale CO2 removal, sequestration, safe sequestration. That Azolla layer is in the Arctic sediments. It's safe there, and we can do that under the subtropical jars.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Viktor. We're there. We finished on time, so thank you very much to the panelists and to Amber as well for being here this evening for all of us. This was a very fruitful conversation. Very happy to have it with you. And for the others, hopefully, who have the courage to continue, please do. There's plenty of other sessions to watch with similar topics such as this one. So please stay tuned, visit the exposition, have some chats with people on the platform. Do enjoy. And for the others, we'll have a great day. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for your enlightened moderation, Antoine.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.